This can't be real.
$72 million evaporated the moment a rusty iron key turned inside a forgotten cellar door. Family loyalty had died long before that, traded for quick cash and hollow luxury. When Blanca Martin refused to surrender a decaying stone cottage, she didn't just defy her brother, she rewrote a legacy. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Kensington and Croft law offices, mirroring the tempest brewing inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom. Blanca Martin sat rigidly in a high-backed leather chair, her knuckles bone-white as she gripped the edge of the conference table. Across from her sat her older brother, Alden Martin, scrolling lazily through his smartphone, completely detached from the gravity of the moment. Their father, Theodore Martin, had been dead for exactly 34 days. In that brief span, the grief that had hollowed Blanca out had been entirely replaced by a simmering, suffocating rage. Theodore had been a giant of a man, a textile magnate who had commanded respect not through fear, but through an eccentric, quiet brilliance. He had loved their sprawling family estate, Martin Hall, with a fierce devotion, but he had died leaving behind a labyrinth of hidden debts, leveraged assets, and a chaotic financial portfolio that even his most trusted accountants struggled to untangle. Alden, ever the pragmatist with a penchant for European sports cars and high-stakes poker, saw only one solution: liquidation. "It is a straightforward proposition, Blanca," Alden drawled, finally setting his phone face down on the polished wood. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit. "Apex Holdings is offering $72 million for the entirety of the Martin acreage. That clears the estate's debts, pays off the IRS, and leaves us both with a very comfortable 8-figure sum. It's not just the logical choice, it's the only choice." Blanca glared at him, her dark eyes flashing. "Apex Holdings wants to bulldoze the manor, Alden. They want to tear down a house that has stood for over a century to build a sterile, soulless luxury eco-resort." Dad would turn in his grave. "Dad is dead, B," Alden replied coldly, the false warmth dropping from his voice. "And he died broke. Or near enough to it. You haven't looked at the ledger for the structural repairs the main house needs. The foundation is cracking, the roof is a sieve, and the property taxes are exorbitant. I am not spending the next decade of my life playing the tragic, impoverished lord of the manor just to preserve your sentimental delusions." Sitting at the head of the table was William Kensington, the family's longtime probate attorney. He cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Alden is correct about the financial reality, Blanca. The estate's liquidity is non-existent. However, Blanca is also correct that the sale to Apex Holdings requires unanimous consent from both heirs, as per your father's rather unusual trust structure." Alden sighed loudly, leaning forward. "What is your price, Blanca?" "Name it." "Do you want a larger share of the cash? 60-40? Take it. I just want this albatross off my neck so I can move on with my life." "I don't want your money," Blanca snapped, her voice deadly quiet. She opened the thick leather folder in front of her and pulled out a faded, hand-drawn surveyor's map from 1922. She slid it across the table toward her brother. "I will sign the consent forms for the sale of Martin Hall and the surrounding 498 acres, but I am carving out this." She tapped a slender finger on a small, irregularly shaped parcel of land at the extreme southern border of the property. Alden frowned, leaning in to look at the map. "The stone cottage? Are you out of your mind? That place is a ruin. It hasn't had running water since the late 90s. It's overgrown, it's damp, and it sits right on the property line, abutting the old state highway. It was the original homestead of the family before the manor was built." Blanca fired back, her tone uncompromising. "Dad spent his last few months sitting on that porch. It means something to me. You can have the mansion, Alden. You can have the 72 million, minus whatever Apex deducts for the 2 acres I'm keeping. But the cottage stays with me, free and clear, deeded solely in my name." Alden barked a harsh laugh, looking up at Kensington. "Can she do that? Can we subdivide it at this stage?" "It is highly irregular," Kensington murmured, tapping his gold pen against his notepad. "But legally permissible, provided Apex Holdings agrees to the revised parcel dimensions. The cottage sits on the absolute fringe of their proposed development zone. It shouldn't interfere with their primary construction footprint for the resort. They'll probably throw a fit, but fine," Alden said, waving a hand dismissively. He looked at Blanca with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You want to live in a moldy, rat-infested stone hut while I cash a check for $30 million? Be my guest, little sister. I always knew you lacked ambition, but I didn't realize you actively craved poverty. Just have the papers drawn up, William, Blanca said, ignoring Alden's barb. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her outward demeanor remained entirely composed. 2 weeks later, the paperwork was finalized. Gregory Finch, the ruthless, slickly dressed acquisitions director for Apex Holdings, had initially balked at the subdivision. He had argued, threatened, and tried to bully Blanca into relinquishing the cottage, claiming it would disrupt the aesthetic flow of their resort. But Blanca had held firm, threatening to blow up the entire $72 million deal. Finch, recognizing that Alden was desperate, and Blanca was immovable, finally capitulated. On a brisk Tuesday morning, the final signatures were scrawled. Alden walked out of the law office with a triumphant smirk, already dialing a real estate broker in Manhattan to arrange viewings for penthouses. Blanca walked out with a single brass key and the deed to a derelict stone cottage. She had lost her childhood home, but she had saved the only piece of the estate that truly felt like her father. She had no idea that her stubbornness had just armed a financial time bomb. The reality of Blanca's decision hit her the moment she forced the swollen oak door of the stone cottage open. A heavy, stagnant odor of mildew, wet earth, and old wood rolled out to greet her. The cottage was a two-story structure built in 1740 from rough-hewn fieldstone, featuring a steeply pitched slate roof that had thankfully survived the decades of neglect. Inside, the space was cloaked in shadows. Dust motes danced in the pale beams of sunlight that managed to pierce the grime-caked windows. The furniture was draped in yellowing sheets, looking like a gathering of silent ghosts in the fading afternoon light. There was no electricity. The main line from the estate had been severed years ago. The plumbing was a relic of the mid-20th century, and the massive stone hearth in the center of the living room was choked with the ash of fires that had burned out long before Theodore Martin had passed. Blanca dropped her duffel bag on the uneven wide-plank floorboards. A profound sense of isolation washed over her. Just 2 miles up the winding private road, heavy machinery was already arriving at Martin Hall. Apex Holdings was wasting no time. The distant mechanical growl of excavators tearing into the manicured gardens she had played in as a child felt like a physical blow. Meanwhile, Alden's social media feeds were a relentless barrage of opulence. He was posting photos from a Michelin-starred restaurant in Tribeca, clinking champagne flutes with models, celebrating his newly acquired freedom. He had sent Blanca a single text message since the signing. "Hope you bought a good space heater. Enjoy the rustic life." "Focus," Blanca muttered to herself, shaking off the chill. She had a trust fund, a modest one left to her by her mother, separate from the estate's chaos, which gave her enough capital to survive and begin renovations. She wasn't destitute, but she was entirely alone. Over the next month, Blanca threw herself into the grueling physical labor of reclaiming the cottage. She scrubbed centuries of grime from the walls, tore out rotted baseboards, and battled an aggressive invasion of ivy that had practically grown through the kitchen window. The physical exhaustion was a welcome distraction from her grief. To handle the structural repairs and the modernization of the plumbing and electrical systems, she hired Tyler Gable. Tyler was a local contractor in his late 30s, a quiet, broad-shouldered man with a deep respect for historical architecture. He didn't ask prying questions about why the daughter of Theodore Martin was living in a dusty ruin while her brother bought yachts, but he worked with a meticulous care that Blanca deeply appreciated. It was mid-November, during a week of torrential, freezing rain, that the cottage began to reveal its anomalies. Tyler was in the small ground-floor study, a room dominated by massive built-in mahogany bookshelves that spanned the entire back wall. He was mapping out the routing for the new electrical conduits when Blanca heard him call out from the hallway. "Hey Blanca, could you come in here for a second?" Blanca wiped her dust-covered hands on her jeans and stepped into the study. Tyler was standing with a tape measure extended across the floor, a deep frown carving lines into his forehead. "What is it? Did we hit a water pipe?" she asked, a spike of anxiety hitting her chest. Her renovation budget was already stretched dangerously thin. "No, nothing like that," Tyler said, letting the tape measure snap back into its casing. He knocked his knuckles against the heavy oak paneling between two of the bookshelves. "I was trying to calculate the square footage to order the right amount of radiant heating coils. The exterior measurements of this side of the cottage don't match the interior measurements." Blanca blinked, not fully understanding. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Tyler said, pointing to the wall. "From the outside wall to this interior wall, there should be about 12 feet of space. But inside this room, the wall ends here. There's a discrepancy of about 5 feet, a 5 by 12 foot void." It's too large for a chimney breast or standard cavity wall. Blanca frowned, stepping closer to the bookshelves. Could it be a structural reinforcement? Dad always said this place survived the hurricane of '38 because it was built like a fortress. Maybe, Tyler said doubtfully. But look at this. He knelt on the floor near the base of the central bookshelf. The wide plank oak floors here were secured with heavy, wrought iron square nails, true to the period. But Tyler pointed a flashlight at a faint, almost imperceptible seam in the wood that ran horizontally across the base of the shelf. I noticed a draft coming from under the trim, Tyler explained. He pulled a thin crowbar from his tool belt. Do you mind if I pry up this floorboard? If it's just empty space, we might have a serious foundation issue or a sinkhole. Do it, Blanca said, her pulse quickening. Tyler wedged the flat end of the crowbar into the seam. With a sharp grunt of effort, he pushed down. The ancient wood groaned in protest, a terrible shrieking sound of nails pulling free from joists. A section of the floorboard popped upward. Tyler grabbed it with his gloved hands and wrestled it completely out of place. A blast of cold, stale air rushed up from the gap, carrying with it a distinct metallic scent, like old pennies and machine oil. Blanca dropped to her knees, shining her own phone flashlight into the void. It wasn't empty earth or a crumbling stone foundation. Sitting flush beneath the floorboards was a massive, industrial-grade steel plate, bolted into a concrete frame. And right in the center of the plate was a recessed, heavy iron wheel, the kind found on the watertight doors of a submarine or a bank vault. What on earth? Tyler breathed, rocking back on his heels. Blanca reached out, running her trembling fingers over the cold, dusty steel of the wheel. Her mind raced back to her father. Theodore Martin had always been paranoid about banks, deeply distrustful of digital markets, and obsessed with tangible assets. But a hidden vault beneath a colonial cottage? Tyler, Blanca said, her voice barely a whisper. Help me clear the rest of these boards. It took them 2 hours of back-breaking labor to pry up the surrounding flooring. When they were finished, the full extent of the hatch was revealed. It was a 3-by-3-foot square of heavily reinforced steel, seamlessly integrated into a thick concrete collar that bypassed the cottage's original stone foundation entirely. It was modern. It looked like it had been installed sometime in the late 1980s or early 1990s. I can try to open it, Tyler said, eyeing the heavy wheel, but if it's locked from the inside or seized with rust, we're going to need a cutting torch. Try it, Blanca commanded. Tyler gripped the iron wheel with both hands. He braced his boots against the steel plate, took a deep breath, and wrenched his shoulders hard to the left. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The wheel refused to yield. Tyler gritted his teeth, a vein bulging in his neck, applying every ounce of his strength. Suddenly, a loud metallic clack echoed through the small study. The locking mechanism had disengaged. The wheel spun freely. Tyler grabbed the recessed handle beside the wheel and pulled upward. The hatch was counterweighted, lifting with a smooth, hydraulic hiss that proved it was far more sophisticated than a simple storm cellar door. Below them, a steep, narrow staircase of diamond plate steel descended into pitch blackness. Stay here, Blanca said, her voice shaking slightly as she stood up. Are you crazy? Tyler countered, grabbing a heavy-duty maglite from his toolbox. I'm not letting you go down into a sealed underground bunker alone. The oxygen levels could be toxic. Let it air out for a minute. They stood in silence, listening to the hum of the rain against the roof, staring into the dark maw of the cellar. The air coming up was cold, but it didn't smell toxic. It smelled meticulously filtered and dry, completely dry. All right, Blanca said after 5 agonizing minutes. She took the flashlight from Tyler. Let's go. The descent felt like stepping out of the 18th century and into a Cold War bunker. The steel stairs echoed sharply under their boots. As Blanca reached the bottom, she swept the powerful beam of the maglite across the space. It was a cavernous room, extending far beyond the footprint of the cottage above. The walls were lined with thick, poured concrete, and a complex network of PVC pipes and ventilation ducts ran along the ceiling. In the corner sat a massive, dormant industrial dehumidifier and a backup generator system. Theodore Martin had spent a fortune down here, completely off the books. But it wasn't the engineering that made Blanca's breath catch in her throat. It was what occupied the center of the room. Row upon row of heavy, fireproof filing cabinets lined the left wall. On the right, sitting on steel shelving units, were dozens of identical, matte black Pelican cases, the kind used for transporting sensitive military equipment or high-end photography gear. Is this a panic room? Tyler whispered, shining his light toward a heavy electrical panel on the wall. He walked over, flipped a heavy breaker switch, and miraculously, a row of caged LED lights flickered to life overhead, illuminating the subterranean vault in a harsh, clinical white glow. Blanca didn't answer. She walked slowly toward the nearest shelving unit, her eyes locked on the heavy black cases. She reached out and unlatched the heavy clasps of the nearest box. It popped open with a hiss of equalized pressure. Inside, nestled in custom-cut high-density foam, were rows of rectangular gold bars. Not small bars, massive heavy ingots, stamped with the insignia of a Swiss refinery. Blanca gasped, stumbling back a step. She threw open the next case. More gold. The next case held velvet pouches. She untied one and poured its contents into her palm. A cascade of glittering, flawless, uncut diamonds tumbled into her hand, catching the LED light and refracting it into 1,000 sharp prisms. "Oh my God," Tyler muttered, staring over her shoulder. "Blanca, there has to be tens of millions of dollars here, maybe more." "He hid it," Blanca whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. When the textile business started failing in the late 90s, everyone thought Dad was losing his touch. He claimed bad investments, market downturns, but he was liquidating his personal assets. He was draining his own offshore accounts and turning it all into untraceable physical wealth. He buried it down here. Her father hadn't died broke. He had died a billionaire who refused to let the IRS, his creditors, or his reckless son touch his true fortune. But Blanca's eyes were drawn away from the glittering wealth and toward the drab gray filing cabinets on the left wall. Wealth was one thing, information was another. Theodore Martin had been a man who collected secrets as avidly as he collected money. She walked over to the first cabinet. It was locked, but a key hung on a small hook right beside it. She turned the lock and pulled the top drawer open. It was packed with meticulously organized manila folders. She pulled out a folder labeled Apex Holdings, Finch, G, Back Channel. Blanca frowned. She opened the file and began to read. Her blood ran cold. Theodore hadn't just known about Apex Holdings. He had been investigating them for years before his death. The file contained copies of private emails, wire transfer receipts, and offshore shell company structures. It detailed a massive, illegal kickback scheme orchestrated by Gregory Finch to bribe local zoning officials and environmental regulators in Somerset County. Apex Holdings wasn't just building a resort. They were illegally acquiring protected wetlands and laundering foreign money through local construction contracts. But it was the document at the very back of the folder that made Blanca's heart stop. It was a certified, original copy of a land deed dating back to 1910, accompanied by a modern surveyor's analysis commissioned by her father just 2 years ago. "Tyler," Blanca called out, her voice sharp and urgent. "Look at this." Tyler tore his eyes away from the gold bars and walked over. Blanca laid the map on top of the filing cabinet. "Alden sold the Martin estate to Apex for $72 million, Blanca said, speaking rapidly as the puzzle pieces slammed together in her mind. The deed Alden used for the sale was the modernized one from 1950, which placed the boundary of the main estate right at the edge of this cottage's 2 acres. "Right," Tyler said. "That's why you were able to keep this place. Look at this surveyor's report from 2 years ago." Blanca pointed a trembling finger at a section of the document highlighted in yellow. The 1950 deed was flawed. A clerical error at the county records office miscalculated the property line based on an old dried-up creek bed instead of the true geographical marker. This original 1910 deed, which supersedes the 1950 document legally, proves that the boundary of the stone cottage parcel isn't 2 acres. Tyler leaned in, reading the fine print. His eyes widened. It's 400 acres. "Exactly," Blanca breathed, a fierce, predatory smile spreading across her face. "The stone cottage parcel includes the entire southern valley, the primary access road, and the natural spring. The land Alden just sold to Apex Holdings, half of it doesn't belong to the main estate. It belongs to the cottage. It belongs to me." Alden had sold $72 million worth of land that, legally, he only owned half of. The multi-million-dollar resort Apex Holdings was currently tearing up the ground to build, was sitting dead center on land that was wholly and entirely owned by Blanca Martin. Suddenly, a heavy rhythmic thumping echoed from above them. Blanca and Tyler froze. Thump, thump, thump. Someone was pounding on the heavy oak door of the cottage upstairs. Blanca quickly shoved the folders back into the cabinet and locked it. She turned to Tyler, her eyes wide. "Shut the cases! Turn off the lights! Tyler moved with practiced speed, snapping the pelican cases shut and hitting the breaker. The underground vault plunged back into suffocating darkness, save for the twin beams of their flashlights. They hurried up the steel stairs. Tyler grabbed the hydraulic handle and pulled the heavy steel hatch down. It locked into place with a solid clank. They hastily shoved the wooden floorboards back over the hole, tossing a dusty canvas dropcloth over the area just as the pounding upstairs grew frantic. "Blanca, open the damn door!" It was Alden. Blanca's heart hammered against her ribs. She wiped the dust from her face, exchanged a tense look with Tyler, and walked out of the study, down the narrow hallway to the front door. She threw the deadbolt and pulled it open. Alden stood on the crumbling stone porch, flanked by two men in dark suits. One of them was Gregory Finch. Alden looked completely unhinged. His designer coat was soaked from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his usually smug face was pale and drawn with panic. "Alden?" Blanca said, feigning confusion. "What are you doing here? I thought you were in Manhattan." Alden pushed past her, stepping into the damp hallway of the cottage, his eyes darting around wildly. "Where is it, B?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "What did you find?" "What are you talking about?" Blanca asked, crossing her arms defensively. Gregory Finch stepped into the doorway, his eyes as cold and dead as a shark's. "Miss Martin," Finch said smoothly, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his anxiety. "We have run into a complication with the title insurance on the main estate. A historical discrepancy regarding the boundary lines. Your brother seems to think you might possess some of your father's old private records." Alden turned on her, desperation making him ugly. The bank froze the funds. "Blanca, the title company flagged an overlapping claim from a 1910 deed. Apex is threatening to sue me for fraud if I can't produce a clean title. If Dad had original documents, he would have kept them here. He practically lived in this hellhole before he died." Blanca looked at her brother, seeing the ruined, panicked boy beneath the expensive clothes. She thought of the gold beneath her feet. She thought of the blackmail files that could send Finch to federal prison. And she thought of the 400 acres of prime real estate she now controlled. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Alden," Blanca said smoothly, holding his gaze with absolute icy calm. "But it sounds like you sold something that wasn't yours to sell. Now, get out of my house." Morning arrived with the aggressive roar of diesel engines, violently shaking the antique glass of the cottage windows. Blanca Martin awoke on a makeshift cot in the living room, every muscle coiled with tension. She threw off her wool blanket and marched to the front window. Just beyond the dilapidated stone wall that marked her 2-acre perimeter, 3 massive yellow bulldozers were parked directly across the only access road leading to the state highway. A crew of men in high-visibility vests bearing the Apex Holdings logo were aggressively tearing up the asphalt, effectively blockading her in. Gregory Finch was not a man who accepted defeat, and he was clearly done playing by the rules. Tyler Gable emerged from the kitchen, holding 2 mugs of black coffee. He handed one to Blanca, his jaw set in a hard line as he stared out the window. "They're claiming it's a necessary utility trench for the resort. Total lie. They're trying to starve you out, cut off your access, and force you back to the negotiating table. Finch knows that if that 1910 deed sees the light of day, his $72 million acquisition is legally worthless." "He's panicking," Blanca murmured, taking a sip of the bitter coffee, "which means he makes mistakes. But we can't stay on the defensive." They had spent the entire night hauling the filing cabinets and the pelican cases out of the main vault, transferring them into a secondary, concealed crawlspace Tyler had discovered behind the boiler room. If Alden or Finch managed to secure a fraudulent search warrant or simply decided to break in, the subterranean vault would appear as nothing more than an abandoned, empty bunker. Blanca knew she needed heavy artillery. Theodore Martin had operated in the shadows, but Blanca needed someone who could fight in the blinding light of a courtroom. Using a burner phone Tyler had purchased from a local convenience store, she made a call to Boston. She reached out to Harrison Caldwell, a notoriously ruthless real estate litigator whose hourly rate made Wall Street bankers flinch. Caldwell had once represented her father in a hostile takeover bid in the 90s and owed the Martin family a favor. When Blanca finally managed to sneak off the property by hiking 2 miles through the dense, muddy woods to meet Caldwell at a diner in Somerset County, she laid the 1910 deed and the Apex kickback ledger on the sticky Formica table. Caldwell, a silver-haired man with eyes like chipped flint, reviewed the documents in absolute silence. When he finally looked up, a predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Your brother sold them a ghost, Blanca. And this man, Finch, He has left a paper trail of bribery so egregious it could bring down the entire local government. What is your objective? Do you want a larger payout from Apex? No, Blanca said, her voice hard as iron. I want the resort project terminated. I want the land preserved. And I want Alden and Finch to walk away with exactly what they deserve. While Blanca mobilized her legal strike team, Alden was spiraling into a catastrophic meltdown. His lavish lifestyle had been built on a house of cards. Anticipating the $36 million windfall, he had taken out massive, high-interest loans against his future assets to cover gambling debts in Macau and a disastrous cryptocurrency margin call. Now, with the Apex funds frozen in escrow by the title company, his creditors were circling. Desperation drove Alden to madness. 3 nights later, amidst a rolling thunderstorm, Blanca awoke to the sound of breaking glass. She slipped out of bed, grabbing a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. Creeping into the hallway, she saw a shadowed figure tearing through the study, violently yanking books from the mahogany shelves, frantically searching for a hidden lever or switch. Looking for something, Alden? Blanca's voice cut through the darkness like a whip. Alden spun around, a crowbar clutched in his trembling hands. He looked feral, his designer clothes ruined, his eyes bloodshot and wild. Give it to me, B. I know Dad hid the real money down here. You have to split it with me. If I don't get $5 million by Friday, the people I owe are going to break my legs. Or worse. Before Blanca could respond, a massive shadow filled the doorway behind Alden. Tyler Gable, who had been sleeping in his truck parked around the back for security, stepped into the study. Without a word, Tyler grabbed Alden by the collar of his soaked jacket, effortlessly wrestled the crowbar from his grip, and dragged him kicking and screaming out the front door, throwing him face first into the muddy gravel of the driveway. Don't ever come back, Tyler warned, his voice a low, terrifying rumble over the thunder. Blanca stood on the porch, looking down at her brother as he sobbed in the mud. There was no pity left in her heart, only a cold, absolute resolve. The endgame had arrived. The boardroom of Caldwell and Associates in downtown Boston was a masterpiece of intimidation, all glass, steel, and sweeping views of the harbor. Blanca sat at the head of the long table, flanked by Harrison Caldwell and Tyler Gable. Across from them sat Gregory Finch, looking pale and dangerously sleep-deprived. Beside Finch was Richard DuPont, the silver-haired, impeccably dressed CEO of Apex Holdings, who had flown in from Chicago on his private jet after Caldwell sent a highly classified courier package to his personal residence. Alden was there too, sitting at the far end of the table, looking like a man awaiting the guillotine. Let us dispense with the corporate theater, Caldwell began, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He slid a certified copy of the 1,910 deed across the table toward DuPont. As you are now aware, Richard, your acquisitions director purchased Martin Hall using a flawed 1,950 land survey. 400 acres of the property you intend to develop, including the primary access roads, the Central Valley, and the watershed, belong exclusively to my client, Blanca Martin. Finch slammed his hand on the table. It's a forgery! Or an outdated claim that won't hold up against a modern eminent domain filing. We have the county zoning board in our pockets, Blanca. We will tie you up in litigation for the next 30 years. Blanca didn't flinch. She simply looked at DuPont. Mr. DuPont, your acquisitions director is quite correct about having the zoning board in his pocket. In fact, he's been paying them off for 3 years. Caldwell slid a second, much thicker folder across the table. It was Theodore Martin's ledger. DuPont opened the file. As his eyes scanned the wire transfer receipts, the offshore shell company names, and the explicit email transcripts detailing bribes to local environmental inspectors, all the color drained from his face. You see, Blanca said softly, leaning forward, my father was dying, but he wasn't blind. He knew Apex was circling his land. So, he hired private investigators to look into Mr. Finch. I have already sent digitized copies of this entire file to the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the FBI field office in New York. The originals, however, remain secured. Finch choked, his bravado instantly collapsing into terror. He looked at his boss. Richard, I did what I had to do to secure the acquisition. It was for the company. DuPont slowly closed the folder. He didn't even look at Finch when he spoke. You are terminated, Gregory. Effective. Immediately. Apex Holdings will be cooperating fully with the federal authorities regarding your rogue, unauthorized actions. Finch looked as though he had been shot. He stood up, his hands shaking, and stumbled out of the boardroom without another word. DuPont folded his hands, turning his sharp gaze to Blanca. You have us boxed in, Miss Martin. A criminal scandal of this magnitude will tank our stock price. Developing the resort is now impossible. What are your terms? Apex will void the purchase of Martin Hall, Blanca dictated clearly. You will abandon the project, withdraw all machinery by midnight, and sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding my father's files. In exchange, I will state to the authorities that I possess no further documentation beyond what has already been submitted, limiting the